and being able to face those things from a sober perspective. And then again, working on those skills that I talked about. So I'm not going to get into a lot of the statistics other than to say a high percentage of folks that come to us in substance use disorder treatment are trauma survivors, either diagnosable with post-traumatic stress disorder or some subclinical form of trauma reactions that they come to us with. And you're going to find that throughout the presentation. There's a number of slides, particularly that I added in at the end, that I'm not necessarily going to cover today, but I wanted them there for you to be able to use as reference points. Trauma comes from lots of different experiences. When you're doing that initial assessment on someone, it's a really critical piece to investigate their experience with trauma. Certainly not to go into great depth or detail. We don't want to traumatize people or make them feel overexposed by way of the assessment. But we really want to get a sense of, are we dealing with trauma symptoms that are a year old, that are 10 years old, that are 40 years old? Because that's going to give us a glimpse into how ingrained trauma reactions are, how much insight somebody might have into what of their behaviors and their skills are trauma driven as a way of protecting themselves from their trauma experiences and the symptoms that creates for them. Just as importantly as I would argue maybe more importantly than understanding what caused your trauma, I'm very interested in how has your trauma shaped the way that you view the world. So we have beliefs about ourselves, about others, and about the world. And trauma pretty reliably alters all of those things in some way. But it's this altered worldview that I really want to try to understand in someone. So, you know, a non-traumatized individual may have a belief that the world is a just place, that people are basically good people, may impact their spiritual beliefs. It very much can impact one's sense of inherent value and lovability, or my belief that good choices leads to good outcomes. The one that I would highlight here is that inherent value and lovability. There's an incredible amount of shame in the substance use disorder population. I've never met anybody that woke up one day and said, I would really love to have this disorder that's going to create all of this chaos in my life. And so someone who finds themselves on that path almost by default questions, what did I do wrong to get here? What is wrong about me that I landed here when other people have not landed here? So kind of coming from that worldview of questioning my value or questioning my lovability. You know, I said 20 years ago, we tried to separate treating trauma from treating substance abuse. And I'm going to be talking a lot today about the impossibility of that and how incredibly naive we were as a field to think that that was A, possible, and B, meaningful in some way. Trauma and substance abuse are linked in many, many ways, in experiences and in neurological functioning, in brain functioning. And part of that is self-medication of emotional pain. Very often people will say, you know, the beginning of their substance use was social anxiety, that I found out if I had a couple drinks before I got together with people, or if I used some cocaine before I connected with people, I felt like I functioned better. It kind of tamped down that anxiety enough that I could function. Or I have trouble sleeping. I hear this a lot in my depressed population, in my veteran population. I recognize that if I have 6 or 8 beers before I go to sleep, I feel like that's curing my insomnia. A lot of psychoeducation happens around that creating a scenario in which you pass out is not the same as creating a scenario in which you improve your sleep. But those are all the ways that that trauma and substance abuse kind of start getting entwined. It gets much more complex than that.
So Dr. Jansen, we have one of our first questions, and it is, do you think that the stats on men with PTSD is lower in men because men are less likely to seek help due to their own stigma?
Short answer is yes. Long answer is I think it's much more complicated than that, but yes, absolutely. I think there's still a cultural stigma around that allows women to be more help seeking than men. I also think that a lot of men's, and again, when we say men or women, I'm talking very stereotypical. Obviously, there's a wide range among and in between genders, but I think men have very traditionally had cultural, social interactions arranged around substance use, particularly drinking, that have not translated in the same way into traditional female culture. So if I think about, I do a lot of work with first responders. And when I think about, a tragedy happens in a firehouse and they all get together and drink about it. So I think there's a social acceptance of substance use that highlights problem use in females sooner than it would highlight problem use in males, if that makes sense. And I didn't say this at the beginning. I'm happy to take questions as we go along. So don't feel like you have to save them all till the end if you're like me and you'll forget by then. The underpinning of trauma-informed treatment is this understanding sympathetic and parasympathetic arousal. So parasympathetic, if we think about, maybe not so much this year, COVID was so weird for Thanksgiving, but if you think about that traditional post-Thanksgiving haze that people are in, where you're just very relaxed and you're working on digestion and just very kind of calm, if not asleep, that's parasympathetic arousal. And that's one of the things that trauma impedes, is that ability to achieve and remain in that parasympathetic state. So we think about sympathetic arousal as energizing, getting up, going and doing things at the extreme end of that fight or flight. And the parasympathetic is very relaxed and kind of calm. As we're doing trauma-informed care, we're trying to teach people to achieve that parasympathetic state and to maintain that state in the face of potential threat. So the changes that happen in the brain as a result of trauma. We know that hippocampal mass decreases. It can actually atrophy over repeated exposure to trauma, which has impact on learning, memory, and probably for our purposes, most importantly, forming expectations of new situations. At the same time, the amygdala is overreactive. So what happens is this impairs threat assessment. So threat assessment is how we determine at the brain level whether we need fight or flight, or we should be sympathetically or parasympathetically aroused. So I remember speaking with a veteran of several tours in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we were talking about his experiences related to threat assessment. And he said, this thing happens every day. He said, I'm sitting in the living room and I hear someone come in the room, or I kind of sense them coming in the room, and immediately I get fight or flight, and I'm trying, do I need a weapon? Where's the weapon? Is this a life threat? What's going on here? What if I don't have access to a weapon? Hand-to-hand combat, can I do that? How do I need to move to put myself in the best position? And it's my mom coming in to tell me that it's time for dinner. And she comes in every day at 5 o'clock and tells me it's time for dinner. And I go through this every day. So kind of losing that ability to accurately assess threat. And I think we see that in a million different iterations across all of our individuals that we serve, is either an under assessment of threat. Think about the domestic violence victim who has left the home and is now planning to go back to get his or her possessions. And as a provider, I'm saying, don't do that. That's not safe. And they're saying, he's not going to hurt me. She's not going to hurt me. He knows it's over. She knows it's over. I'm just going to get my stuff. So not having that ability to accurately up assess a threat, or not ability to down assess a threat. It also affects our stress hormones, which influences that ability to be sympathetically versus parasympathetically aroused. So cortisol levels drop, which means we have less energy. Our glucocorticoids, which is our stress rebound. So I had a stressful event and now I can calm myself down. I have lower levels of that, lower ability to calm myself down after I've been sympathetically aroused. Higher levels of epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is going to put me on a hair trigger to over-assess a threat. Constantly living in that fight or flight is very damaging to to organs and systems in the brain. So higher levels of medical problems, particularly autoimmune problems, and then lower levels of serotonin, which is our stress shutoff valve. So I can't calm myself down as reliably, or sometimes I just can't calm myself down at all. So all of those things, trauma related, are making changes in the brain. And then you have substance use disorder, which also is making changes in the brain, changes in structure and function in what's going on in the brain. So we know that substance use disorder is progressive. How fast or slow varies by individual, but as someone is more frequently abusing a substance, whatever that mood altering substance is, they increase in amount that they're using over time, they increase in frequency that they're using over time. And at some point, the brain goes from substance abuse, but I'm not dependent, I can walk away from it, to substance use disorder, to that dependence, kind of the old term that we used to use. When that line is crossed between I frequently abuse substances and I am dependent on substance, there are substantial changes that happen in the brain, structural and functional changes that happen in the brain. And the research is still out on whether that's a permanent change or not. So we can get scans of brains of individuals formerly dependent on a substance, would now no longer be actively dependent on a substance, have been not actively dependent for 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and their brain on PET scan looks like a non-substance dependent brain. However, recent research has also demonstrated that with proper cues introduced, even subliminally, well, that didn't come out right, subliminally, the brain starts to respond like a substance-dependent brain, even after 20 years of sobriety. So there's question about, once that's changed, can it ever go back again? So in our brains, in all of our brains, dopamine is released into the nucleus accumbens, and that is my quick, oh, let me back up a second. I think I went too quick there. Dopamine helps us experience pleasure. And so even in a non-addictive brain, this process happens. So if it's a really cold, really rainy day and I pull into the CVS and I get a parking spot right up front, I might get a little boost from that. I might get a little, ooh, yay me from that. Substances, addictive substances, are going to give me exponentially more of a jolt of dopamine than a simple pleasurable experience. So the process is the same. The intensity is way off the charts. You're never going to get a parking space that's good, that makes your brain feel as good or produces as much dopamine as a line of cocaine is going to produce, for example. So, and the likelihood that that experience with that substance is going to lead to repeat behavior is that reliability and intensity of that release of dopamine. It is that dopamine hit that makes substances so appealing to our brains, because it feels really good. That provides a shortcut to that pleasure reward center. The hippocampus kind of joins in there and lays down a memory of that rapid sense of satisfaction. The amygdala kind of chimes in to create a conditioned response to certain stimuli connected with that pleasurable experience, that intensely pleasurable experience. And then the learning process gets involved, because that experience of pleasure alone doesn't capture the whole thing. Okay, I had that really great time that one time. It doesn't explain why I'm drawn back to repeating that experience. It's really the role of learning and memory that drive that compulsion back to that experience. So I don't make this sound too complicated, because it's really not, unless you're a brain scientist. So if you think about that pleasure reward center in our brain, that emotion regulation center, I think of it as the I want what I want, when I want it, the way I want it kind of center of the brain. So if you live with a toddler in your household, you've seen this brain in action, because that's the brain that toddlers operate from. Their frontal lobes they're structurally there, but they're kind of not wired up yet. And it's our role as adults in the life of a toddler to, over time, as that starts to come online, that executive functioning starts to come online, to kind of teach them to sort of lead with that prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is where executive function happens, where we delay gratification, where we predict consequences to our behavior, we predict outcomes, we make decisions, we make choices in that prefrontal cortex. So as we develop, as we age, and that comes online, and we start to, instead of leading with that emotion regulation center, we start to lead with that prefrontal cortex with input from the emotion regulation center. It doesn't go away. So if I walk into a bakery and with my mask on, and I see a gorgeous chocolate cake, my reward center is going to light up and say, wow, I want that cake. And actually, I want the whole cake. And just pack it up with a fork because I'm going to eat the whole thing because it looks fabulous. In a fully functioning adult, on a good day, at that point, my frontal lobe is going to kick in. My prefrontal cortex is going to say, whoa, whoa, whoa. No, you cannot need nor have an entire chocolate cake. And there's a negotiation that happens back and forth that may result in me ordering a piece of chocolate cake or sharing the chocolate cake. I always laugh when I say that because I'm still working on that. Or it may, if my prefrontal cortex is having a great day, I order a cup of tea and I'll leave without the cake at all. But there's that lightning negotiation that goes back and forth. The winner, ultimately, generally speaking, being the prefrontal cortex with some input from that emotion regulation center. What happens once that brain has functionally changed and is now a dependent brain, is that emotion regulation center is driving the bus more often than not. I actually attended a seminar once where the presenter talked about that emotion regulation center as being Darth Vader and that prefrontal cortex being Minnie Mouse. So they can coexist. And sometimes Minnie can have a word, and Minnie can make good choices, is capable of making good choices. But when Darth's awake and Darth's not happy, Minnie can't stand up to Darth. And that's been a really helpful way for me to think about what's going on in that dependent brain. The other, I was going to say fatal flaw, unfortunately too often true. The other flaw that happens in the dependent brain is that substance gets misfiled as necessary for survival. So that substance, if my substance is alcohol, my brain now miscalculates that alcohol for me is necessary for survival. Alcohol is as important now as food or other things that I need. And that becomes an issue when we talk about cravings and compulsion. So essentially, that emotion regulation center is now hijacking that prefrontal cortex, which is extremely problematic in adults. I kind of just already said that. Part of that dependence process is developing tolerance. As the brain is repeatedly exposed to dopamine producing substances, our brain will respond by naturally turning down its own dopamine production. This becomes very critical in understanding early recovery, is when someone stops using that substance and they stop artificially inducing that dopamine, the brain does not say, oh, hey, I'm going to turn up to full volume of dopamine production today so that I can have some energy, have a decent mood, do some planning, carry out some functions. The brain doesn't do that. That volume turns back up. That dopamine production turns back up at a snail's pace, which is why any of you who work with people in early recovery will recognize things like, if this is sobriety, you can have it. I feel like crap. I'm tired of feeling like crap. I have no energy. I don't know why anyone would want to live like this, because it takes a long time for that dopamine production to come back online. And depending on the substance of that the individual is dependent on, and how much they've consumed over how long of a period of time, really plays into how long it takes that dopamine production to come back online. It can be a significant amount of time. The problem with compulsion, or the complexity with compulsion, is that the normal machinery motivation is no longer functioning. And this can happen with non-substance related behaviors as well. If you think about emotional eating, eating is designed to be satisfying because it's something that we need to do to maintain life. And so the way our system is designed is that my body will cue hunger signals, and then it will move me towards seeking out food. And when I have a very acute hunger and I seek out something that is very delicious and satisfying, that emotional fulfillment that comes from that is very powerful. That's how the system is designed. Your body needs fuel, you get hungry, you find satisfactory fuel, you put it together, and things are working. But even with something like food, you may have had the experience, I certainly have, or certainly know someone has experience, who will eat when they're not hungry, and will maybe even eat when it's not particularly delicious. There's that compulsion that starts to separate the normal machinery of motivation, and things can get out of control, even outside of chemical dependency. And then there's the issue of cravings. The physiological drive to seek dopamine will trigger cravings, and that contributes not only to the development of the substance use disorder, but to relapse. I can make a conscious decision that I don't want to engage in this behavior anymore. That's not going to stop my cravings. Keep in mind that substance has now been misapplied as something that is necessary for survival. So if I'm a little bit hungry, I can maybe put that off, or I can make good food choices. The hungrier I get, the less likely I am to make good food choices, and the more likely I am to overindulge, because that sense becomes more and more acute. And the same thing happens in cravings. So if you think about cravings as hunger, it helps you to kind of understand that intensity and where choice making becomes an issue. So here's what happens when we put those two things together. Those are separate but connected processes that are going on in the brain of an individual who's experienced trauma, as well as the brain of an individual who's experienced substance use disorder. And when you put them together, you get something that looks like this. So environmental cues can drive my trauma symptoms, which is going to turn up my cravings and compulsions. Or environmental cues are going to trigger my substance use disorder, and that in turn bumps into my my trauma symptoms, and
so
we get
Dr.
essentially
Jessen,
a brain.
So we have a question in regards to cravings. So are cravings going to be more intense for trauma clients with SUD than non-trauma clients with SUD?
I don't think the research suggests that the cravings are substantively different. I think they're bumped into more, to use a scientific term. So the cravings themselves are not any more present or any more intense, but all of the trauma symptoms that can trigger those cravings tend to keep the brain more activated. Does that make sense? No. I miss being able to see people. So anybody who has worked with the early recovery community knows all of these things to be true. When somebody first comes to the place of even considering sobriety, one of the realities that we have to look at is how much scorched earth is in the path of how they got to where they are today. So frequently we see difficulties with some, many, all of these things in early recovery. This is for somebody without a traumatized brain, without those trauma symptoms. When you add all of these realities, all of these social realities, with the challenges of early recovery, and then you add all of the trauma symptoms in on top of it, it becomes much, much more complex. So the focus of trauma-informed care is to help the individual understand their trauma symptoms from a strengths-based approach. I'm going to go into just a little bit more detail about that in a minute. We really have to cut down the risk of re-traumatizing an individual, and that is something that 20 years ago I think we were very much guilty of. We had a very proscribed kind of path to treatment, And it was, get on board or come back when you're ready. And that's incredibly traumatizing to somebody who's experiencing trauma symptoms in the throes of early recovery. And then identifying supports that are trauma-informed is really key, and I'm going to come back to that again. So looking at skills that have previously helped an individual survive a trauma that they are now tripping over is really the important piece of this strength-based approach. We describe trauma survivors in treatment as being reactive and defensive. They have skills to protect themselves. They may be rudimentary skills, they may be very overdeveloped skills, but they are skills that in some level, by some interpretation, were protective of them during their traumatic experiences or at some point earlier in their life. They're still continuing to use those same skills, and now they're not working for them, or they're creating more problems than they were designed to solve. So seeing somebody as self-protective rather than defensive can be helping them see themselves. So us seeing that in someone, but more importantly, helping them see that in themselves is a much more solid foundation to launch recovery than some of these other labels that are not looking at the strength behind the behavior. I used the example of being help rejecting a little bit earlier. Trauma survivors very often, and again, this is using an incredibly broad brush to paint a lot of individuals with a lot of individual experience, but really want to see themselves as self-reliant. Going back to that, if I were more of something, this wouldn't have happened to me. If I were less of something, this wouldn't have happened to me. I really just want to be able to take care of myself because I don't trust other people. So that need to be self-reliant is very high. The skill level at being self-reliant could be all over the map. Typically, particularly in early recovery, we see people without great self-reliance skills, but they have a boatload of self-reliance motivation. They really want that, and that can look to us as help rejecting. But it's really important to see that as their effort to take control of their own experience. And we frequently label people in early recovery as treatment resistant or defiant. And I would relabel that as they're not trusting, and why would they be? We're typically new to them in their life. They don't know us. Their experience with people in the general community has probably been judgmental, dismissive, going back to that stigma thing. And very often I'll hear people say, I tried therapy earlier in my life and it wasn't a good experience. And so now you're coming back and I'm saying, but that wasn't me. You can trust me. And the question is based on what? And so I think shifting trauma-informed care really is shifting from the expectation that I'm the provider and so you will trust me to I really need to work hard to earn your trust in order for this to work, and I'm willing to do that. When you're doing trauma treatment, again, we're talking about trauma-informed care now, but when you're doing the full scope of trauma-informed treatment, we talk about, and there's 100, it's probably being a low estimate, of different protocols for treating trauma, or different ways of looking at treating trauma. But what they kind of boil down to is Herman's version from many years ago of establishing a sense of safety, mourning what was lost, and reconnecting to where you are in your life now. So I wanted to kind of put this up there so you could see where trauma-informed care fits into that whole continuum of treating trauma. It really is about that establishing safety, establishing trust in others, and just as important, establishing trust in myself as an agent, as a meaningful agent in my own recovery process. And always keeping in mind Maslow's hierarchy of needs when we're looking at starting to intervene with somebody. Where are we intervening at? And being aware that very often we are intervening at that most base level, that physiological needs, and keeping in mind that the rotten apple in the barrel, so to speak, is that the substance is falling in there. When we get people in early recovery, from their brain perspective, the substance that we're trying to help them move away from is living in that bottom part of the slide. I also put this up here. I'm not going to go into detail about talking about the seeking safety protocol. I do have a number of slides about it at the end of the presentation. But one of the things that I find very useful about seeking safety is one component of the treatment, whether you're doing individual or group therapy, and it is well adaptable to both. is resource seeking. So at the end of group, we talk about what's your commitment for next time and what's one resource that you're going to investigate. And sometimes we do that as a group, what would be good for a group to look into. And sometimes we do that individually. So is that food insecurity resources? Is that some kind of socialization that's rooted in abstinence or sobriety? And this hierarchy gives us a good idea of thinking about where to kind of guide people to choose that resource, that community resource. And I think even if you're not using Seeking Safety, some focus on community resource and reaching out to engagement in the community is important for both the traumatized population as well as the substance use disorder population. Both of those populations, as well as hordes of others, to be honest, but are very isolating conditions where, because of self-stigma or because of other stigma, people withdraw from connection. They withdraw from community supports. They don't feel worthy of community support or community inclusion. And yet consistently research shows us that that is a critical component of long-term recovery. And so constantly looking at and building skills towards feeling worthy to engage in community, feeling okay with accepting support, and what does that look like for me? And I love this picture. Anybody who's ever been in treatment with me will freely talk about the yellow brick road. Because I started out talking about that clean line trajectory that we drew 20 years ago of what recovery will look like. And I have yet to ever work with anyone whose recovery looked anything like that. Very often in early recovery, with or without the overlay of trauma, people will say to me, like, I don't feel like I'm getting anywhere. I feel like I'm doing the things we're talking about and I feel very stuck. And I like to pull out this picture of the yellow brick road, although I'm aware at some point I'm probably going to start running into people too young to remember what the yellow brick road is. And when Dorothy begins that fateful journey, the beginning of that road is a circle. She's going literally turning in circles as she's starting on her path. And I think that's an important reality for us to keep in mind in recovery, is very often it feels like we're turning in circles when we're trying to get our bearings. So back to that primary goal of safety in trauma-informed care. The underpinning of that, the entire underpinning of that is learning to make positive changes to bring a sense of safety. And first and foremost of that is helping people recognize that substance use is not safe. It may be familiar, it may be torturous, it may be a lot of things, but that it is not safe physiologically or emotionally. And most particularly with a traumatized population is learning to set boundaries, particularly for adult survivors of childhood abuse of some sort. One of the barriers that creates is that they don't learn how to set boundaries. They don't learn how to set healthy boundaries. I work with a high volume of adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And consistently, the one thing that experience teaches you is that your body is not your own. It doesn't matter what your preferences are for your body. It doesn't matter what your rules are for your body, because that's not the final say. And so that really flowing from that, if I can't set boundaries related to my own body, how do I learn to set boundaries? What boundaries do I learn how to set? And so that's a significant issue for trauma survivors in recovery, even independent of substance use disorder, is learning how to set healthy boundaries, and learning to tolerate the fact that other people are not going to give you permission to set those boundaries and are probably not going to support you in setting those boundaries. And just as important is finding safe ways to handle traumatic intrusions. So that the basis of this is identifying for you, what are your trauma symptoms? Moving away from that, I'm weak, I'm stupid, I'm overreactive, I do these things because I'm just not worthy enough to not do these things, and relabeling those things as your trauma reactions. And some of those are internal reactions, such as the veteran who has that threat assessment issue in his head every night related to his mom. And some of those are external. I remember working with with a judge who was also a veteran, a career veteran of the armed forces, and him sharing about a time he was standing out in front of the courthouse talking to colleagues in his three-piece suit with his very expensive leather briefcase, and a car driving by backfired and he hit the ground. He just flat out hit the ground in his suit, briefcase flying in front of his colleagues. So there can be also that external humiliation, that I react in such a way that causes me great embarrassment or great humiliation. And then learning sober coping strategies that are actually effective and helpful. People come to us in treatment with coping strategies. They got themselves to treatment one way or another. They have coping strategies. It's really a matter of helping them to identify which ones are effective and don't cause additional harm to them, and which ones are ineffective. And I talk to folks about fine-tuning their coping skills rather than creating coping skills. I would never disrespect an adult by saying, you have no skills and I'm going to teach you all of them. I think about it as cleaning out the closet. Let's clean out the coping skills closet to see what things still fit and what things are still in fashion, and what things maybe need modified or aren't still in fashion anymore. And then also talking about healthy living patterns. Sometimes I think we dismiss that as something that kind of everybody knows. Whether you're doing it or not, you still kind of know it. And I don't think that's always a fair assessment. So the commitment to trauma awareness as a foundation of trauma-informed care, changing that question from what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. And I would challenge you, not right now when anybody can see what you're doing, but at some point, just practice asking those questions. Ask those two questions back to back and feel physically and emotionally how different it feels and sounds to ask what is wrong with you to what has happened to you. It's just a much more accurate and compassionate way to assess what's going on with an individual, sometimes with yourself. And again, seeing behaviors not as flaws, but as previously effective skills that are just no longer needed or no longer effective. And that's why I like to use the analogy of cleaning out the closet. You know, I can go back through my closet and I can find things that were super cute in the 80s that I would not be able to leave the house in now for a variety of reasons, fashion being only one of them. So, you know, that white leather skirt would have looked awesome in a disco in the 70s, and it really has no place in 2020 society. So I find that to be a really non-judgmental way to kind of help people assess what are the skills that just aren't working for them anymore. As an agency, how do you demonstrate that you are operating in a trauma-informed care way? And obviously that takes more than talking about it or thinking about it for an hour. But I just wanted to give you kind of a look from the literature about what does that involve. So we talk about creating a safe context, which is a physically safe environment. And I would go beyond that. I had a mentor one time who said to me, we cannot do therapy within walls that weep. Look around. Is there a way that you can make your environment attractive, calming? Again, we're going to be focusing on trying to teach people to engage in parasympathetic arousal, relaxation, calming at the core level, at the biological level. Can you do something in your environment that can cue that can kind of help that? Having clear and consistent boundaries, transparency, predictability. This goes to how you implement your policies. So if individual A comes into group and says something that is disturbing to the group, and we step back and take a collective breath and we process that without judgment, and then the following week, a different person comes in and says something quite similar, and we engage in shaming or blame, or you shouldn't say that, or you can't do that here. Now you're creating an unsafe space. What is the expectation of me in this place? So one of the expectations that we have in the clinic that I most recently worked at is you can be angry, you can be frustrated, and we're going to help you express that in a way that's safe and doesn't put anybody at risk. At the point at which you physically harm or put your hands on someone, that's our hard stop. That is our hard, we can't just talk our way through that. So no hands on. If you say ugly words, we'll help you with that. We'll process that. So having those clear boundaries that apply to everybody as much as possible. And then there's that choice word again. So it is very, as someone who's directed a clinic, it is very expeditious to say, here's what we offer. We offer IOP and it's 12 weeks. We offer aftercare and it's 6 weeks. We offer early recovery and that's 12 weeks. And we really need to move away from that to what's going to fit best for you to reach the goals that you have for yourself at this point in time. So that choice word, I think it comes up on the next slide again. Oh, first thing, restoration of power. So I am not the authority in your recovery. We're going to partner in recovery to be able to determine what is the best path forward for you from a strengths-based approach. What do you got in your toolbox already? And we don't want to take any of that away from you. We want to build on that. And that's where the skill building comes in. And then building self-worth. The double whammy of trauma and SUD is typically a very low sense of self-worth, or a sense of self-worth that is entirely rooted in others, what others think of me, what others are willing to give me permission to do. So doing that by healthy relationships, by showing respect and compassion, by all of those things that we know that we should be doing in your entire work environment. So we don't just train our clinicians to have these skills and to interact with people in this way. We train every human body in the building how to engage with people on these issues in a respectful, compassionate, non-judgmental way. And we do that through training, education, and lots of coaching, strength-based coaching. I really like how I saw you interact with that individual who was getting so worked up today. How was that for you, and how can I support you, and what that was like for you? So agency-wide, really critical that every body who comes in your building, and I'm talking about the front office folks, the custodial folks, the nurses, the physicians, whatever's present in your environment, all gets that same training on that same perspective, and all gets that same strengths-based coaching from that same perspective. I really like the Seeking Safety protocol because it's good guidance without being manualized. I'm not getting any funding from anybody involved with that in order to say this. I've just used it, and I find it very adaptable to individual and group settings, and to all kinds of skill levels. So I put some slides in here about that in case you're interested in that, or if you're not familiar with it. But I'm not going to go into that right now. I want to kind of stop there. I've said a lot of words. And I want to see what kind of questions folks have.
All right, thank you, Dr. Jansen. I've been monitoring the questions and we've asked the ones along the way. But if anyone else has any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. It's down the bottom in the right-hand corner. We still do have a few minutes. I do have the one last poll question for everyone to also complete. But Dr. Jansen, thank you very much for that information. It was so helpful and very good to hear. I really appreciate all the information that you were able to provide, and I can't wait to share the slides and see the rest of the information. And I think we do have a couple more questions. If you can hang on, bear with me for 1 minute. All right. Dr. Jansen, will we be able to get a copy of the slides? Ashley, as the tech, do you know? Are the slides available for the members that participated? I do believe so, but I can double check that information for you, and I'll see with our organizers where they are going to house those slides.
I will make a request. Oh, I was just going to say, I will ask if we can get the slides uploaded to where the breakout session recordings will be posted as well, so that you can get all that information. That'll be available on the Symposium website.
Okay, and then Dr. Jansen, do you have an opinion on the efficacy of EMDR for addictions?
I'm not trained to provide EMDR, and so I can't really speak to it from experience. The science looks promising. And I think we are ultimately going to move in the direction of more brain-based interventions. I think it just makes sense as we understand more of the brain-based science that is going, that has been just accumulating over the last number of years. So I have great hope for it. I think how fast we can move forward with that is in some way entwined with how much we can break through the stigma surrounding particularly substance use disorder, again, from others, but also from the individual who experiences that disorder themselves.
And then another question is there a typical duration for how long trauma treatment usually takes to address the 3 stages of trauma?
No, not that I've seen consistently in the research. I would say from a personal perspective, I can kind of gauge a correlation between how long the trauma lasted to and how long it is between if there is a break in the trauma experience, the length of time between that I've survived that trauma experience and how long it takes me to get to treatment. There does seem to be some sort of inherent correlation in that I have not seen reflected in the research at this point. And particularly, again, if we had these clean breaks between I'm treating someone who just has trauma or I'm treating someone who just has substance use disorder, I think we might have a little better luck of figuring out how long does it take to treat that. But we don't get people like that in real life or in research studies. So I think it's just not that clear. And I think there's a ton of other variables that go into that. So someone who comes in for trauma treatment with a solid support system, who loves them and cares about them and doesn't know how to help, versus somebody who comes into treatment with very poor supports or in abusive relationships or just a lot of chaos going on in their life. I think that plays a big part of it too. So the short answer is no. I didn't give you a short answer, but the short answer is no.
There you go. And also, Dr. Jansen, how do you handle clients who clearly have signs of trauma, but have not yet identified trauma with your SUD clients? And then a second part is, do you continue to use trauma-informed care even when it is not specifically identified as a client may not recognize trauma?
Absolutely. I think we can talk about cues. We can talk about symptoms. My clients tend to prefer the idea of cue rather than symptom. We can talk about what cues your cravings, what cues your compulsions, without actually understanding what started that or what caused that cue. So for somebody who's not yet ready to recognize that the way I grew up was traumatic, or is not yet ready to recognize that the relationship that I'm in is causing me trauma, we can still look at what's your day-to-day experience and how do we help you cope with that day-to-day experience. And I think for a long time, prior to trauma-informed care, we worked really hard to live there. Let's just live there with your here and now experience and how do we help you today and how do we help you cope. Really what trauma-informed care has given us is this value added of recognizing these threads that go from your here and now experience to these other things that have happened to you. But if somebody's not ready to pull on those threads, we can still help them with the impact of the threads. And that does happen. I think there are a fair number of people who, for whatever reason, find themselves in early recovery who are just not ready to deal with the full scope of how I got here. And so we really need to, and it goes back to that choice. We really need to live in the here and now and what can we do to help today get better? And then at some point down the road, you can decide if you want to back up and kind of figure out where some of that comes from. I think of a woman, just amazingly resilient woman that had, I mean, her story, you couldn't make a Lifetime movie out of it because people would say all of that stuff could not possibly have happened to one person. Like, it's just too much. And yet that was her story. And she was very much there. I cannot look at those things and stay sober. And so we didn't look at the things. We looked at the fallout from the things. What gets you worked up? What gives you cravings? What gets you sympathetically aroused? And we worked on all of those for a good long time. And when she was really solid in her sobriety, we had kind of met all those goals. And I remember sitting down with her saying, what do you want to do here? Like, do you want to start going back to that stuff and you want to work on that stuff? And I just remember her saying, she had a lovely little accent. And I remember her saying, oh, Kathy, why would I want to do that? I'm sober, I'm happy, I'm living a better life than I've ever lived. Why would I want to go back and look at that? And that was her decision. You know, and far be it from me to say, no, there's trauma, we must work. She was happy, and I actually ran into her not that long ago, and she stayed happy and sober and satisfied in her here and now life, and we just never touched it. Again, we've learned so much. 20 years ago, that wouldn't have been an option. You must deal with your trauma. Uh-oh, I lost volume. Oh, there you go.
Diane, I believe you're muted.
Much, Ashley, for letting me know that. I just said that's a perfect story to end on, and we're almost at our closing time. So I just once again want to thank Dr. Jansen for her wealth of knowledge and her presentation. I thought it was very informative. And I'd also like to thank our audience for participating. And we appreciate you at DDAP for being a part of our symposium. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Dr. Jansen. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Anything else I have to do?
Nope, I will close this session.
And
once
do you know if they
everybody's
get
out.
slides? I'll just check with.
I made a request to I actually already sent an email to the training team to ask for the slides to be uploaded to the website once the live recordings are.
We'll see you later.
All righty, you're welcome. Have a good one.